Today on 300 Baud, we'll take a look at my Commodore 64 Reloaded MK2 by Individual Computers. Before we get started on my Commodore 64, I thought it'd be nice to review a bit of history. The Commodore 64 was released in August of 1982 at the introductory price of $595. It competed with the likes of the Apple IIe, Atari 800XL, and Tandy Color Computer 2, outlasting all of them until production finally ended with the demise of Commodore in April of 1994. But don't worry, despite the loss of Commodore, the Commodore 64 scene is far from dead. The first signs of life came in 2004 with the release of the C64 Direct-to-TV, a single-chip implementation of the Commodore 64 computer built into the form of a classic 1980s competition pro joystick. Thanks to Jerry Ellsworth, the board featured exposed solder points that allowed for the connection of an external keyboard and floppy drive. 2018 saw the release of the diminutive C64 Mini, shortly followed on by the full-size C64 Maxi, now with a real working keyboard. But as good as they are, they don't use real Commodore chips. Real Commodore computers have become pricey and difficult to find in good working condition. Over time, the power supplies fail and begin to damage components on your board. The C64 Reloaded by Individual Computers is a drop-in replacement motherboard that uses the original Commodore 64 chipset, a standard 12-volt power supply, and has incorporated the vulnerable PLA and RAM. An alternative to the C64 Reloaded would be the Ultimate 64 drop-in motherboard replacement. Unlike the C64 Reloaded, the Ultimate 64 is a FPGA implementation of the original Commodore chipset. I personally consider this a synthetic solution, but it does come with some nice features you won't find on the Commodore Reloaded board. For those who are a bit more adventurous, you can purchase new unpopulated motherboards. We also have new cases, mechanical keyboards, Raspberry Pi modifications, ITX cases, and even a remastered Commodore 128 that fits into a Commodore 64 shell. So let's take a look at the top of the case for my Commodore 64. What I've got here is a Commodore 16 case that's been modified to accommodate the Commodore 64. Now, the cases are actually very similar to each other, but there are a few differences, and I'll try to point those out. So like I said, this is just the top of the case. First thing I've done is I've replaced the keyboard with a Commodore 64 keyboard because there are some subtle differences in the keyboards between the Commodore 16 and the Commodore 64, mostly in the cursor keys, the way they locate those, a couple other minor differences. Another thing is I like this version of the keyboard because it's got these gray function keys. Some of the Commodores I've noticed are kind of like an orangey color, and these are more of a gray, which matches the badges really nice on this. So I've gone ahead and replaced the badges with the Commodore 64 badges as well. So the keyboard and the badges came from a pretty rough Commodore 64 that was all broken up. And so I've taken a pretty clean Commodore 16 to modify it to get the black keyboard or the black computer that I was looking for. So lifting the top of the case, I've got my Commodore 16 kind of sitting under it. So you'll notice there's a big difference between the Commodore 64 and the Commodore 16 as far as the overall size of the motherboard. So here we've got the Commodore 64 at the bottom, and this is the motherboard that I use to swap out chips to the MK2. You'll notice that I've pulled all these chips out. So I pulled the CIAs, which I believe were here, the VIC-2 chip, which was over here, and the SID chip, and this guy, I'm not exactly sure what I've got there. But I pulled all those, and those have gone into my Commodore 64 Reloaded MK2 motherboard. And this is still a good board, but I do know that some of the memory is burned out on this, which wouldn't be too hard to replace, but yeah, it's in good condition. Now, taking a look at this next to the Commodore 16, here we've got the Commodore 16. I believe we have the 6510 processor here. This would be the TED chip in here. We've got a couple of ROM chips. Not sure what this one is. And then some RAM over here. On the port-wise, there's quite a reduction in the number of ports, and the layout is a little bit different as well. So if I line these guys up here, you'll notice I've got my, expansion port or cartridge port here. This is my RF out, my video and serial ports for the drives and printers. And then on the Commodore 64, we would typically have our cassette interface in this location. We do have the cassette on the 16, but it's a much smaller, small mini DIN type style. And then we got the user port, which is completely missing on the Commodore 16. So you can see the motherboard's gotten quite a bit smaller, and the number of chips have been reduced. So I could take a look at the motherboard layout with the Commodore 16, and you'll notice that I've got, in this area, I've got my, well, they call it the memory expansion. This is where the cartridge port is at. Here's my RF output. It's in this area. And then I've got my video and serial outputs, and then my cassette deck that's going out. So now let's take a look at the bottom of the case, and this is where I've mounted my Commodore 64 Reloaded MK2 motherboard. Some of the features that we have on the motherboard is we've got our joystick ports on the side, and they're in the exact same place as the Commodore 64 or Commodore 16. We also have our power switch, and this is our power input. This is using a standard power supply with a barrel connector that you would find on just about anything nowadays, which is really nice because you can just put 12-volt DC in. I believe it calls for 2 amp, but you can run it on a little bit less. In this area, this is where we've got our keyboard connector, and we have our first CIA chip located here. And then over here we've got our SID chip. This motherboard allows for 2 SIDs, so I could do a stereo setup if I wanted to, but currently I've just got the one. And here we have our VIC-2 chip and our 6510 processor located on this side. And back here, this is our second CIA chip. So looking at the back side of the case, we've got our cartridge port in the exact same location as the Commodore 16. This area here, this is my S-Video and 3.5 millimeter audio jack output, which is actually mounted on a little board at an angle, which is kind of interesting. This happened to, I had to cut this out a little bit to get this to fit the case. And then I've got my, I'm not sure which one's which, but I've got my video and my serial port for the disk drive and printers. There's no modification, they land in the exact same place. Over here, this is my cassette port. This one I had to trim out, had to do some cutting. Unfortunately, this part of the case on the Commodore 16 is open, so I could try bridging this with some plastic, but for now this is just open, but it's not been a problem for me. And over here is my user port, and I had to actually cut this out. I had to use a little Dremel tool and actually remove that. So there's a little bit of trimming going on right in this area over here, but pretty much everything else, a little tiny bit of trimming over here, and maybe a little trimming over here, but not too bad. So the case fits together really nice. So here's the documentation that came with the MK2. It's in German, but I can make some sense of it. Looks like something about some new motherboards in 2017. We've got the Commodore 64 Reloaded MK2 and the Amiga 1200 Reloaded. This is individual computers. They had actually bought the right to use the Commodore name. Here we go. This is probably something along the lines of back in Germany, because I know I've seen that on their website before. But kind of a neat little flyer. This is the actual user guide for the MK2. Take a look on the inside. I love the Commodore branding. Then we've got a little bit here. It says, congratulations on the purchase of this newly produced replacement board for your Commodore 64. To operate the Commodore 64 Reloaded MK2, you need the following. CPU 6510 or 8500. 2 pieces. I need CIA 6526A or 8521, so it'll use either or. I need the VIC-2 6567, 6569, the 8565 or the 8562, 1 or 2 sound chips, 6581, which is the one I have, or the 8580. Commodore 64 housing, I'm using the Commodore 16 housing. The power supply, so 12 volt DC regulated, 1 amp recommended, 2 amp, or minimum is 1 amp or 2 amp recommended. So yeah. Inserting the chips, you just use the ZIF sockets, which is really nice. Those are some really nice ZIF sockets on this one. So looking at the inside of the board, looks like we've got some of the things here. We've got some kind of a diagnostics LED. Here's our CIA chip number 2. Here's our parallel, actually our user port. Here's the CPU. So this, in my case, is a 6510. Let's see here. We got some kind of case LED flash on air. I haven't actually seen that. Here's our cassette port. Here's our oh wow, a USB connector. Haven't even really seen that looking at the motherboard. Here's a serial connector. Here's our video output. Here's our S video output, which is a pretty exciting feature to have. Here's our audio output. This is our expansion port. Here's our keyboard connector. And going around here, this is our CIA chip right there. Here's our SID ports. I'm using just one of these guys. If you have 2 SIDs, you can have stereo. Not sure how that's going to work with software. And then we've got our VIC-2 in this location right there. So pretty nice little board. Really easy to work with. Moving around to the back. Yep, it says Commodore back in Germany. Individual computers. So this is a great board. I absolutely love this board. This is one that I missed the MK1 and they sold out, and I was so excited when they got the MK2 out, and I just had to have it. Okay, so I'm back at the Tiny Desk, and now I'm going to connect my Commodore 64 to this Dell monitor that accepts an SVGA input. So I'm going to use this Wiko command control joystick. It's a very nice stick. And I'm going to put this one into my controller port 1. And then I'm going to take my power and plug this into the computer. So this is your standard 12 volt. Along the back, I've got tucked away a Commodore SD to IEC adapter. And this allows me to plug in standard SD cards and use these as a floppy drive for the Commodore 64, which is just absolutely fantastic. It's essentially like having a hard drive. So in the back, I'm going to connect my, this is my user port or cassette. This is my cassette port. This is what is going to feed power to my SD to ICE. There we go. And then I'm going to plug in the serial port. Now on this Commodore 64, I'm not plugging in to the video port. It has a video port, but instead I am going to use the S connector. So plug that guy into this very unique connector for the Commodore 64. This is part of the reason why I bought the MK2 Reloaded, was so I have S video out. And here is my audio connector. So I'm going to plug this guy in, just like that. So everything's plugged in. So now let's go ahead and give power to the monitor. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to plug in, and that's my fast load cartridge. This thing is awesome. So let's go ahead and get the fast load plugged in. This will speed up load times, but also it adds the wedge, which basically adds easier commands to the Commodore DOS. So it's much, much easier to use. So if I have everything connected properly, I should be able to turn on the power. And there we go, Commodore 64 basic version 2, 64K RAM system, and it's ready, and I've got the fast load prompt, so that means my fast load cartridge is ready to go. So the fast load is going to give me some really nice commands. I can type in a / and then type in a $, and that's going to give me the directory, if I list it, so I can see that I've got this is FB64, and I've got a games directory, a music directory, productivity directory as well. So I'm going to go ahead and load the first program on the computer, which is the FB64. FB64 is used to be able to read into directories on the Commodore 64. So if I run that, it's going to load the directory structure, and I can go into any of these directories that I've built. And in this case, I'm going to go into the games directory and hit return. It's going to load. Now it's going to take it a little while because I've got quite a few games installed on this SD card. Not a crazy amount, but a few.
A few moments later.
Alright, so here's some games I've got loaded up. I've got 1942, 1943, Afterburner. Let's go ahead and take a look at Afterburner just for fun. Oh, it crashed. Not sure what's going on here, folks, but she's having a hard time. One cool thing about the MK2 Reloaded is I've got a reset switch. So that's reset. Now I also have to back out of this directory, so I'm stuck in the Afterburner directory, so I have to push a reset button on the SD2IEC, and I'll give my directory again another shot, see what I've got on here now. There we go. Now I can load the FB64 and I can run it. Now one cool thing about Commodore commands is typically if you want to type a command such as run, you just type the R and then a shifted U, and it gives you a short version of the command, so it makes it a lot quicker to type things in. It also reduces memory usage. This was a quick look at my custom Commodore 64. In retrospect, I had a lot of fun building this system. I happen to really like how well the customized Commodore 16 case worked out for my project. The MK2 gives me an authentic Commodore experience without the worry of a 35-year-old power supply sizzling my chipset. If you have access to a Commodore 64 chipset and would like to build your own Commodore 64, the MK2 Reloaded board is still available, as well as new Commodore 64C style cases in a variety of colors. Well, that's a wrap for now. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, consider hitting that like button, and if you have not already done so, please subscribe.